People ask me how old I was when I stopped being afraid of the dark. I tell them I was 16. Then I tell them I stopped being afraid of it because something in the dark introduced itself, and it turned out to be 3 feet tall, perpetually annoyed, and dependent on me for its continued survival. Fear has a hard time sticking around when whatever scared you starts arguing with you about the fastest route to the cafeteria. My name is Norman, and I know how that sounds. Plain name for a plain kid. That's exactly what I was, or so I believed on the morning this started, before the iced tea, before the ringing in my skull that wouldn't stop, before Sophie explained to me very slowly that I needed to relax or I was going to rupture a blood vessel she was currently standing next to. That was a Tuesday. It had been a normal enough September morning at the settlement. Carew Station wasn't a glamorous posting, a mid-tier frontier community, 40,000 civilians, 3 schools, 2 mining operations, and a transit hub that connected us to the larger colony chain. We weren't rich enough to be a priority target for anything and weren't poor enough to be abandoned. We existed in that comfortable middle space where people raised families, argued about zoning ordinances, and mostly forgot that the broader universe was large and indifferent and occasionally hostile. I'd forgotten that completely by the time I was 16, which is, I think, the natural state of a teenager. You're not built for perspective yet. Your world is the size of your school, and the biggest problems in it are the ones that sit directly across from you at lunch. I had problems at lunch. Specifically, I had Ms. Witherington. She was our principal. She'd been principal of Carew Station Secondary for 11 years by the time I got there, and she ran it like a garrison commander running a fort nobody had bothered to attack yet. Uniforms pressed, hallways quiet between bells, infractions documented in triplicate. She wasn't cruel, I want to be fair to her now, because what came later wasn't her fault, but she was relentless in the way that only institutions produce. She had outlasted every argument, every student complaint, every teacher who thought the rules were suggestions. She was the building itself, as far as we were concerned. I had a demerit record that could have wallpapered the main corridor, mostly for talking back, some for being in places I wasn't supposed to be. One memorable entry for unauthorized use of school broadcast equipment that I maintain to this day was a public service. My friend Greta was worse. My friend Marcus was somehow below that. We were not problem students in the dangerous sense. We weren't hurting anyone. We were just the kind of kids who asked too many questions and didn't understand why the answer was always, because that's how it works. That Tuesday, I was sitting on the steps outside the east entrance eating my lunch early, because lunch inside meant a table near Witherington's office and a passive radiation of disapproval that put me off my food. I had a bottle of iced tea that Greta had left from the morning. It was warm. Everything in Carew Station was slightly warm. We were on the dry side of the ridge where the ventilation wasn't quite right, and the climate system ran perpetually behind. You got used to it. You drank the warm tea, and you didn't complain, because complaining didn't make the ventilation system work any better. I was halfway through a chapter of something I've since forgotten, the book, not the moment, when I noticed a sound. It was faint, like a tiny engine losing an argument with gravity. I looked around. Nothing. I looked up. The sky above the settlement was clear, pale blue edging toward white, the way it got when the atmospheric processors were running clean. Nothing up there but the usual transit lane lights, blinking slowly like distant metronomes. Then the iced tea moved. Not a tremor, not a vibration from the ventilation shafts beneath the steps. The liquid inside the bottle actually sloshed, distinctly, in a direction that had nothing to do with my grip. And then there was a sound, a high, thin crack, like something very small breaking something even smaller, and then silence. I stared at the bottle for a moment. I drank the tea. I've thought about that decision many times since. What would have changed if I'd poured it out? Probably nothing. Sophie has explained, with the patience of someone who has explained it too many times to too many people, that the entry happened before the liquid made contact. But still, I drank it, and I put the bottle down, and I went back to my book. And about 4 minutes later, I understood why some days just decide to become the stories you'll spend the rest of your life telling. The headache was sudden and specific, not the dull pressure of dehydration or the slow spread of a tension headache. This was precise, a point of heat behind my left temple that lasted 3 seconds and then vanished entirely, replaced immediately by a voice. Not in my ears, in my skull from somewhere behind my eyes, clear and very close and extremely irritated. This is not a vehicle bay. I dropped my book. Who, I started out loud, and then felt immediately idiotic because I was alone on the steps and talking to nobody. You, the giant, stop moving. The blood flow when you turn your head is significant. There's someone in my head, I said to no one. There are 3 of us, said a second voice, this one lower, steadier, and we apologize for the inconvenience. We had very few options available. I have voices in my head, I amended. We are not voices. We are the crew of the compact-class patrol vessel Meridian 6, currently docked, involuntarily, in your left cerebral cortex. My name is Gus. The one who's been speaking to you since we came online is Max. Our 3rd crew member is Sophie, who is assessing the entry damage and will join this conversation when she determines we are not all about to die. I sat very still. The sun was warm on the steps. Somewhere inside the school, a bell rang for a class I wasn't going to make. How small are you? I said. It wasn't really a question. Small enough that your circulatory system is a navigational concern, Gus said. Large enough that we find your current blood pressure alarming. We need you to breathe more slowly. Sophie has medical training. She's asking. From further back, further inside, which was a thought my brain kept flinching away from, a 3rd voice arrived. Businesslike, precise. Breathe, now. In through your nose, count 4, out through your mouth, count 4. Do it until I tell you to stop. I did it. I don't know why I did it. Shock, maybe. Or maybe there's something in the quality of a voice that knows what it's talking about that bypasses the part of your brain that makes decisions. Sophie sounded like someone who had dealt with crises before and found them only mildly inconvenient compared to what she'd expected. I breathed. The hot edge of panic subsided. Better, she said. Your cortisol levels are still elevated, but you're not going to have a cardiovascular event. Not immediately. I want to know why you're in my head, I said, very quietly, so nobody passing would hear. Pursuit, Gus said. We were tracking a fugitive vessel. He went through a wormhole aperture, unauthorized, unstable, almost certainly deliberately placed, and we followed. We came out of transit somewhere in your ionosphere at approximately 1/10,000th of standard scale, moving fast with no avenue for safe deceleration. The nearest soft landing environment with a temperature gradient we could tolerate was me, I said. Your skull is structurally sound, Max offered, apparently as a compliment. And the fugitive? I asked. I think some part of me already knew. The part of me that reads too much, that asks too many questions, that spent 3 years studying the settlement's contingency protocols for curiosity's sake, and can recite the emergency frequency band assignments from memory. Some part of me had already started running the numbers. There was a brief silence from the 3 of them. Then Gus said quietly, he did not choose a soft landing. The next hour is hard to describe, because it happened simultaneously in 2 places, inside my skull, where 3 small aliens walked me through who they were and what they were doing, and what the thing they were chasing was, and outside my skull, where the world was in the early stages of beginning to come apart and I hadn't noticed yet. The Space Protection Force, as Gus explained it, was something like a border patrol and something like an investigative service, and something like a last line of defense in the narrow margins between the places where larger powers had agreed, provisionally, not to fight. They operated at reduced scale in environments where full-size intervention would constitute the kind of provocation that ended treaties. They were peacekeepers in the precise and unglamorous sense, not warriors sweeping in to save the day, but small crews in small ships doing the slow, unglamorous work of keeping bad actors from finding the cracks between jurisdictions and expanding through them. Zolthard was a bad actor. Gus described him with the flat affect of someone who has made peace with the fact that some things are just catastrophically wrong and all you can do is keep chasing them. He was a builder primarily. He didn't fight. He didn't invade in the traditional sense. He found environments, introduced his droid units, and waited. His droids were small, not as small as the Meridian 6, but small enough to enter a biological host without trauma and nest there, routing through the nervous system, converting voluntary motor control into something they managed from a central transmitter. Once embedded, a host looked and sounded and moved exactly like themselves. They just didn't choose anything anymore. He'd been doing it for a long time. He'd been doing it across 6 systems before anyone had a clear enough picture to authorize a pursuit. He built fleets the way other people built savings, slowly, incrementally, out of whatever material was available, using the resources of whichever population he'd quietly converted. The hosts went on with their lives. Their families didn't notice. Their colleagues didn't notice. And then, when the fleet was large enough and the moment was right, Zolthard pressed a single command, and 10,000 people who looked exactly like your neighbors stood up simultaneously and started doing something else entirely. He hadn't pressed it yet. That was the only advantage we had. How does he coordinate them? I asked. I was keeping my voice barely above a breath, my lips not quite moving, which was something I developed a technique for in 3 years of trying not to get caught talking in Witherington's assemblies. Short-range command signal, Gus said. From a transmitter embedded in the primary host, the one he chose first, the one with the access he needs. The others receive it and relay it, expanding the range incrementally, like a network growing outward from a center point. Each new host extends the broadcast radius slightly. With enough hosts, the signal covers the entire building. With more, the entire settlement. How many does he have now? We can't know the exact number from here, but the signal draw Max is detecting from the building's infrastructure suggests he's been working for several hours. He entered through a wormhole aperture that our instruments date to approximately 0400 this morning. Facility maintenance hours. Low population, high access. 4 in the morning, while the settlement slept, while Caru Station turned slowly under its ventilation systems and its climate processors and its transit lane lights blinking like distant metronomes, Zolthard had been moving through it, finding the right host, settling in, beginning to build. I thought about Witherington in her apartment somewhere in the residential tier, before dawn, sitting in the dark with something looking out of her eyes that wasn't her, and I felt the anger arrive and settle in my chest like a coal. It didn't go away. I let it stay. It would be useful later. The host access is what he needs, Sophie continued. Witherington controls the building's emergency systems, the broadcast override, the evacuation protocols. If he can use those, he doesn't need an army. He just needs one signal at the right frequency, on the right channel, to every personal device in the settlement simultaneously. The devices all carry a passive receiver. It's in the standard communications architecture, a welfare check feature installed after the Meridian IV incident. Most people don't know it's there. It's never been used. A pause. Zolthard knows it's there. He researched us, I said, before he came here. He always does, Gus said. He doesn't go somewhere without a plan. He doesn't go somewhere without knowing its vulnerabilities. He's patient, thorough. The settlements he's taken have generally not realized what was happening until the activation command was sent, at which point realizing it was no longer useful. He's never failed, I said. No, Gus said, then after a moment, not yet. He hadn't pressed it yet. That was the only advantage we had. He needs a host with access, Sophie said. She'd finished her damage assessment minor, apparently, nothing that would affect me in the long run, and joined the conversation. Her voice was different up close, less businesslike. She sounded tired. His droids need a command node, and the command node needs to be embedded in someone with the authority to move the population. Access to communication systems. Access to evacuation routes so he can close them. Access to the building's emergency protocols. I understood then what I'd already understood. "Witherington," I said. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 second. "You know the target," Gus said. It wasn't a question. "She runs the school, and the school has the settlement's emergency broadcast override. It's in the old codes from when this building was the emergency coordination center before they built the civic hub. Nobody uses it anymore, but the connection is still live. I know because I found it. I tried to use it once to broadcast. I stopped. That's not important. The point is it works. And if he can broadcast a command signal on that frequency, he can reach every personal device in the settlement, and probably some of the industrial control systems." Another silence. Then Max said with something approaching respect, "You're smarter than you look." "You can't see me," I said. "I am inferring from the architecture," he said. I need to stop here and say something about what I was feeling, because I think people who weren't there assume I was afraid. I was afraid, certainly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But it was a specific kind of fear, not the formless panic that comes from not knowing, but the sharp, cold, highly functional fear that comes from knowing exactly what's happening and knowing that you're the one who has to do something about it. There's a difference between those two fears. The second one is almost useful. I stood up, I picked up my book, I walked back into the school. I found Greta in the library. She was at a terminal in the far corner, doing exactly what she always did when she was supposed to be in fourth period biology, reading something unrelated and occasionally minimizing it when the librarian walked past. I sat down next to her and I said, very quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you not to make a sound when I tell you." She looked at me for a moment. Greta had a face built for skepticism, not unkindly but precisely. She could convey an entire argument with a single raised eyebrow. She raised one now. "There are 3 aliens in my head," I said. "They've been chasing an intergalactic criminal who is currently inside Ms. Witherington and is planning to use the emergency broadcast system to take over every personal device in the settlement and enslave the population. I need your help, and I need you to not say anything loudly." The eyebrow descended. Something else crossed her face, something I can only describe as a decision being made. "How long do we have?" she said, not loudly. "Sophie, from inside my skull. We don't know precisely. Zolthard's embedding process takes time. The host will appear normal. He'll be cautious. He's been careful for a long time. He will wait until he has full control of the broadcast array before activating." I relayed this. "So he's not going to do it in the middle of second period," Greta said. "Probably not, but he'll want to move today. He has a fugitive warrant active and 3 peacekeepers on the ground, inside my ground, and a timeline that just compressed. Marcus found us 20 minutes later. Marcus was not a subtle person. Marcus's primary gift was that he was large, determined, and had an absolute inability to feel embarrassed on someone else's behalf, which made him extremely useful in situations that required someone to do something that would humiliate any person with a normal social sense. I'd once watched him tell a settlement administrator that her permit denial was procedurally invalid and back it up with a 40-minute citation of the relevant code while she stared at him. He was 16. He hadn't blinked once. I told Marcus what I'd told Greta. He listened. He nodded. "Okay," he said, "what do we need?" And that was Marcus. No questions about whether I was sure, no demands for evidence. He had known me for 4 years, and I had never made up something this elaborate without a good reason, and the fact that I was clearly not enjoying myself was evidence enough that this was real. That trust, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that only grows from 1,000 small, ordinary days of being each other's people. That was the thing Zolthard hadn't modeled for. He'd planned for the access codes and the broadcast equipment, and the nervous system of a school that was also, secretly, the nervous system of a settlement. He hadn't planned for the specific, unreasonable stubbornness of 3 teenagers who had nothing to lose and everything they knew at stake. The 3 of us went to the cafeteria. Not because we were hungry. The cafeteria was the only room in the building with sightlines to 3 separate corridors and a direct view of the administrative wing entrance. Greta had thought of that. She'd memorized the building layout for reasons she'd never explained and that I'd never asked about, because Greta was the kind of person who gathered information the way other people gathered stamps, not for any particular purpose, just because you never knew. We sat with our trays and we watched. Inside my head, Sophie was running calculations. Max was reviewing the settlement's communication infrastructure through the information I was providing. I'd describe something, he'd map it. He'd ask clarifying questions in that precise voice of his while I tried to appear to be eating lunch. Gus was quiet for longer stretches. When Gus spoke, it mattered. "She's coming," he said, at 12:47. Ms. Witherington walked across the cafeteria in the way she always did, measured, deliberate, hands clasped behind her back. She moved between the tables without touching them. Her expression was the expression she always wore: mild authority, mild disapproval, the face of someone who had made peace with disappointment as a permanent condition. But her eyes were wrong. That was the thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. They were the right color, tracking correctly, blinking at normal intervals. But there was something in them that was too still. Human eyes move constantly, even when you think you're holding them steady, tiny adjustments, scanning, processing. These eyes held their target and released it cleanly, like a machine completing a cycle. She swept the cafeteria. Her gaze passed across me without stopping. "She didn't recognize you as a threat," Max said. "She doesn't know where we are, advantage." "For how long?" I murmured, barely moving my lips. "Until he processes everything she processed before the embedding. Her memories are in there. She knew about your disciplinary record. When he cross-references your presence here at this time, he may conclude you're avoiding her, which is normal, and disregard you. Lord. Or he'll note that you're in the cafeteria during a period you're supposed to be in class. Observe that you're sitting with your 2 closest allies, and consider the possibility that you know something." Witherington paused. It was slight, almost nothing. She was near the tray return, speaking to one of the kitchen staff, normal conversation, or what looked like it, and she paused for exactly 2 seconds longer than natural and then continued. The kitchen staff member nodded once slowly and went through the back door. "A teacher," Greta said. She'd seen it too. "Mr. Anderson," Marcus said. He said it like a confirmation of something he'd hoped not to confirm. Mr. Anderson had been at Carew Station Secondary for 7 years. He coached the inter-settlement debate team. He'd stayed after school twice a week for 3 years running to help Marcus with an essay technique that Marcus never quite mastered but kept trying because Mr. Anderson made the trying feel worthwhile. Hearing Marcus say his name then, flat, stripped of everything, told me more about what we stood to lose than anything I'd processed so far. "How many?" I asked. Sophie said, "We can't know, but the embedding takes resources and Zolthard has limited resources without his fleet. He'll have prioritized access points, teachers, possibly the school's maintenance staff. They have independent movement authority. He won't have burned units on students. Students are unpredictable, too much variance." "So we're safe," Marcus said. "You're mobile and uncontrolled," Sophie said, "which is a different thing from safe." We stayed in the cafeteria until the bell. We moved in a group to the corridor outside, where the flow of students gave us some cover, and we talked quietly while pretending to discuss something else. The plan, if you could call it that, had 3 parts, and all three parts depended on something that had exactly a 1 in 4 chance of working under ideal conditions. Greta outlined it, quietly, with the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she'd already stress-tested internally. I've known a lot of smart people since then. Engineers, medics, strategists. I've sat in rooms where people with actual authority and actual resources have mapped out actual plans for actual crises, with projectors and tablets and standing whiteboards covered in dry erase diagrams. None of them have ever been as efficient as Greta was that afternoon in the cafeteria, speaking barely above a whisper with her untouched tray in front of her and her eyes on the corridor. She didn't waste words. She didn't hedge. She didn't say, "What if we, or maybe we could." She just laid it out, step by step, because there was only one path through and she'd already found it. The broadcast override was in the administration wing, behind Witherington's office, in a service corridor that wasn't marked on the public building map, because it predated the current school administration by 2 decades. I knew about it because I'd found it during the incident with the school broadcast, an incident that had earned me a demerit, a formal letter of reprimand, and the discovery that the building's emergency communication infrastructure was both more extensive and more poorly secured than anyone had bothered to document. Greta knew about it because Greta knew about everything. She'd done 3 years of archival research on the building's original construction permits for a history project nobody had asked for, and she'd filed it under interesting in the mental catalog she kept of things that might someday be useful. Marcus knew about it because we'd told him 30 seconds ago. The override unit needed to be physically disconnected from the building's power grid. Not hacked, Zolthard would anticipate a software approach and had certainly already locked the system. He had been doing this a long time. He would know that a digitally inclined population would attempt a digital solution first, and he would have closed that door. The physical relay was behind an access panel in the service corridor. Pull the relay, no signal. No signal, no mass embedding command. No mass embedding command. And Zolthard's current asset count was whatever he'd managed to accumulate in the last several hours, which, if Sophie's analysis of his resource constraints was correct, was a handful of teachers and possibly 1 or 2 administrative staff. A handful of teachers we could work with. The entire settlement was a different problem. "How many people in the settlement?" Max asked as I was turning this over. 40,000, I said. A brief pause. If he sends the activation signal before you reach the relay, we cannot contain the response. 40,000 embedded hosts converging on a single command point is not a situation 3 peacekeepers and 3 teenagers resolve. The window is what matters. You need to be at that panel before he decides he's ready. He doesn't know we know about the relay, Greta said. She'd been following my side of the conversation and filling in the gaps with accurate intuition, which was unsettling in a way I'd gotten used to over the years. His timetable is based on what he knows. He knows the broadcast link is intact. He knows his assets are in place. He thinks he has all the time he needs. So we have until he finishes his preparation, I said. Which is 60 to 90 minutes, Sophie confirmed. If we're moving, we should be moving. The problem was getting to the service corridor, without Witherington or her embedded staff seeing us. "She'll be in her office by now," Greta said. "Pre-broadcast routine, checking the equipment, making sure the link is stable." "How long?" I asked Sophie. "If I had to estimate based on the resource draw I can detect from the building's power grid, which Gus is monitoring through your headache. Yes, that's what that is. I apologize. He's about 60 to 90 minutes from activation." 60 to 90 minutes, I said. "That's the estimate. It could be faster." Marcus said, very calmly, "Then we should go now." The administration wing had 2 entrances. The main entrance was in the front corridor, past the reception desk where Jenna from 11th grade worked the visitor log during afternoon periods. The secondary entrance was through the gymnasium, which connected to the equipment room, which had a door into the maintenance hallway, which led out behind the administrative assistant station. It was the long way. It was also the way that avoided anyone who might be watching the main corridor. We went through the gymnasium. It was empty, afternoon periods, nobody scheduled, and our footsteps were loud in the way empty gyms always are, a specific acoustic quality that announces you regardless of how carefully you move. The floor was a regulation composite surface in alternating pale and dark strips, lines marked for 3 different sports depending on which season the school was running. I'd spent a lot of time on that floor, mostly involuntarily. During the physical education units, I'd managed to get out of for 2 years before Witherington had closed the exemption loophole. I knew every squeak of it. This afternoon it seemed louder than any of that. We went quickly and tried not to hear it. There are things you notice in a crisis that you wouldn't otherwise. Small sensory data that your brain files under irrelevant and then retrieves later, for no obvious reason, at random moments years afterward. The smell of the gymnasium that afternoon is one of mine. Synthetic rubber and recycled air, and the faint chemical edge of the floor cleaner they used on Tuesdays, which it was. Tuesday. It had been a normal Tuesday morning, and now I was crossing a gymnasium in near silence with 2 of my friends, while an alien criminal ran a quiet coup from the principal's office, and the floor cleaner still smelled exactly the same as it always had, and somehow that was the detail that landed. The equipment room smelled of synthetic rubber and old air. Marcus found the maintenance door in the back without a light because he'd been in here 100 times for debate team setup and could navigate it blind. The storage shelves were loaded with sporting equipment I'd never touched and a filing cabinet that had been broken since before I started at the school and which nobody had ever repaired or removed. Greta went first into the maintenance hallway. I followed. Marcus pulled the equipment room door shut behind us and stood in the dark corridor for a moment while we all waited to be sure nobody had heard. The maintenance hallway was a different quality of dark than the equipment room, longer, with a thin line of emergency lighting at floor level that turned the walls gray and the ceiling invisible. It smelled of metal and building systems, the honest industrial smell of the structure that held everything else up. The kind of corridor that exists in every building and that nobody ever thinks about except the people who maintain it, which is exactly why it was safe. Nothing left, I said, not loud, barely a breath. Gus, in my head, 40 meters. The access panel is floor level on the right side. You'll need a tool to open it, it's a quarter-turn fastener. We don't have tools, I murmured. A coin will work, something flat and rigid. Marcus was already reaching into his pocket. He produced a settlement transit token. It was exactly the right thickness. I didn't ask how he'd known. Sometimes Marcus just had things. I've thought about that detail too, the transit token. The 1 credit fare chip that every Carew Station resident carried in their pocket as a matter of habit, because the public transit system was the only reliable way to cross the settlement in reasonable time, and nobody wanted to be caught without one. A coin. A flat, rigid disc of stamped alloy. The tool that shut down Zolthard's network was a transit token in Marcus's jacket pocket, retrieved without ceremony by a 16-year-old who'd used it that morning to ride the crosstown line to school. That detail always gets people. They want the story to involve something significant, a specialized tool, a moment of inspiration, a piece of technology that proved decisive. The transit token disappoints them. I think they're wrong to be disappointed. The transit token is the whole point. We had exactly what we had, we used what was in our pockets, and we made it work. We moved down the hallway. The administrative assistant station was visible through the half-open door ahead. I could see the back of the chair, empty, which was either because the assistant was at lunch or because whoever had been the assistant this afternoon was no longer operating on their own initiative. We didn't stop to find out. We moved past the doorway fast, single file, not looking. The access panel was where Gus said it was. A square of brushed metal about the size of a textbook, with 4 quarter-turn fasteners at the corners. Marcus knelt and fitted the transit token to the first fastener. It turned. The metal made a sound like a key in a lock. Quietly, Greta said, uselessly, because Marcus already knew, and she knew he knew, but fear makes people say things. All 4 fasteners. The panel came free. Behind it was a bundle of conduits and a relay box, matte gray, the size of a paperback, with a single red indicator light burning steadily. Solid link. Active. That's it, Sophie said. The relay on the left, the flat one. Pull it straight out. Don't touch the others. The others run the school's basic systems, and I don't want to plunge you into an emergency. Marcus looked at it. He looked at me. I nodded. He pulled the relay. The red light went out. The corridor was very quiet. That's it, Marcus said, barely above a whisper. That's the broadcast link severed, Sophie said through me. He cannot send a mass signal now. Whatever he's been building toward the activation command, it has no channel. I exhaled. I hadn't realized how shallowly I'd been breathing. Then Greta said, she knows. I looked up. Through the gap in the doorway ahead, past the empty administrative station, I could see the corner of the main corridor. And at the corner of the main corridor, very still, looking directly down the maintenance hallway at us, was Ms. Witherington. Those eyes too still, processing. She didn't move immediately. That was the thing that hit me hardest, not that she was there, but that she didn't move. A human who just caught 3 students in a restricted corridor would have said something, would have expressed surprise or anger, or at minimum would have called out. The pause before she moved was an operating lag, a cycle completing, a calculation finalizing. Then she moved, and she called for someone, 2 names. Voices responded from down the main corridor. Run, Gus said. At the same moment Greta said it and Marcus was already moving. We went back the way we'd come, gymnasium door, through the equipment room, back into the gym's open space. I could hear the maintenance hallway door opening behind us and the sound of steps that were too even, too metronomic, perfectly spaced and never varying. We hit the gymnasium's main door, into the corridor, and immediately I understood that the math had changed. There were students in the corridor, normal afternoon traffic, class change underway, and embedded in that flow were 4 adults moving against it with that same too even gait, converging from 2 directions. Teacher faces I recognized. Mr. Delacroix from chemistry, Ms. Obi from records, 2 others I didn't know as well. They weren't running. They didn't need to run. They were spreading to cover the corridor exits, and they had time. And they were patient in the way that things are patient when they don't care about the outcome. When the outcome is already calculated, and arrival is just a matter of closing distance. You need to warn the students, Max said. Get them moving, out of the corridors. How? I said. The school's intercom is separate from the broadcast system. It's still live. You need access to any class terminal. Nearest classroom, the physics lab, 10 meters to our left. I grabbed Greta's arm. She grabbed Marcus. We pushed against the flow of students and through the physics lab door, and Marcus shoved it shut and braced against it with his back. The room was empty. End of period, the class had just cleared out. I went to the teacher's terminal and I typed in the override code. I knew it because I had once memorized every override code in the public-facing facility manual, which was a document nobody was supposed to read, but which existed in the building's open document archive, and which I had read at the age of 14 because I was bored and curious. Ms. Witherington had given me a demerit for unauthorized access to administrative documentation when she'd found out. The demerit had been accompanied by a personal note handwritten, which was unusual, that read, "This behavior reflects poor judgment and a disregard for appropriate boundaries. I am disappointed, though not surprised." I'd kept the note, not out of spite or not entirely, but because I liked the not surprised part. It meant she'd been paying attention. It meant she knew who I was. I used her demerit-giving code to access her intercom system, while an alien criminal ran her body from the corridor outside. The intercom opened. I said, "This is Norman. Everyone needs to leave the building right now. Do not go to the administrative wing. Do not stop in the corridors. Go to the east exit or the west exit and keep moving. This is not a drill." I heard through the physics lab walls the sound of the school reacting. Not panic, something more organized than that. The sound of several hundred people simultaneously deciding that a voice on the intercom sounding this specific kind of serious was a voice worth listening to. Chairs scraping, doors opening, the collective shuffle and murmur of a student body mobilizing. Behind the door something hit it. Marcus grunted and held. I said, "The teachers in the corridors are not themselves. I don't know how else to say that. Leave the building. Call your families. Get to the civic hub and tell them there is a security situation at the school. Tell them it's the kind that needs a medical response. Tell them it's the kind nobody has a name for yet." I clicked off the intercom. Greta was at the window. "Students are moving," she said. "They're going to the exits. All of them." She watched for a moment. "Enough. The ones near the embedded teachers are giving them a wide berth. I think they can tell something's wrong." "They always could," Marcus said, still against the door. "You just don't say it when there's nothing you can do." The door hit again, harder, and then a third time with a force that sent Marcus back a step, and I could hear the frame flexing. "We can't stay here," Greta said. "We can't go out the main door," Marcus said. "Window," Greta said. She was already at it. Second floor, not ideal, but the equipment stores below had a sloped maintenance canopy that would break the drop. She had the window open before I was across the room. "You've thought about this before," I said. "I think about a lot of things," she said. Marcus went first because he was heaviest, and if the canopy held him, it would hold us. It held. We were on the ground and moving before the physics lab door gave way entirely. We came out into the east service alley, concrete walls, ventilation grates, the smell of processed air discharging from the building system. The alley opened onto the outer grounds, and beyond that the main approach, and beyond that the parking area where a handful of late-period vehicles were still sitting unattended. Nobody intercepted us. Whatever embedded assets Zolthard had managed to position outside the building, they weren't here. We moved to the edge of the alley, and I pressed my back against the wall and breathed. "Norman," Gus said inside my head, very calm, "there's something you should know." "Now is a bad time, Gus." "I know, but what I'm about to tell you is relevant to the next 2 minutes. The relay you pulled severed the broadcast connection, but Zolthard isn't limited to broadcast. He can issue direct commands to embedded units at close range and line of sight, approximately 20 meters. He's been doing it this whole time. That's how he's coordinating the teachers without a signal. So he has a transmitter. It's in the host, in Witherington, which means the only way to stop coordinated pursuit is to sever his ability to transmit locally." "How?" There was a pause, then Sophie, "We can do it, but we need you to get us close, within 10 meters, and we need 3 minutes. 3 minutes, I repeated. "We have capabilities that don't require the ship to be mobile. Max can project a disruptive pulse from inside your cortex. It'll give you a headache you will remember, but at close range it can interrupt the shortwave command signal. If we can get you close enough to Witherington, Max can effectively jam him. Long enough for the embedded staff to lose coordination. Long enough for you to get clear." "What happens to me during this?" "The headache," Sophie said, "and possibly some mild disorientation. Your neurons aren't affected, but Max is borrowing some local electrical bandwidth and your sensory processing will object. And if it works, Zolthard loses his network. He still has the host. He's still in Witherington, but he's isolated. 1 unit, no coordination, no broadcast capability, and 3 peacekeepers who now have ground to work with." Marcus looked at me. He'd been listening to my half of this. He was still holding the door. His jaw was set. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need to get close to Witherington." He thought about this for exactly 1 second. Then he stepped away from the door. It opened immediately. Witherington was in the doorway. Marcus walked toward her, not running, not aggressive. He walked the way he walked into an administrator's office when he was about to cite 40 minutes of code, like a person who had decided something and was now in the process of doing it. She looked at him, processing. He said, "Ms. Witherington, I want to talk to you about the unauthorized closure of the East Cafeteria Service Corridor, which I believe is a violation of Building Code Section 74-2, which specifies minimum egress requirements for occupied secondary facilities." She blinked, not a natural blink. Marcus kept going. He cited codes. He cited subregulations. He made up some that sounded real. He planted himself in her field of attention, and he held it with the pure mulish force of someone who had practiced this on settlement administrators for years and had never once been successfully interrupted. She began to refocus. He could feel her losing interest, the machine behind her eyes calculating that he was not a threat, that processing his argument was a waste of resources. That's when I moved. I came from the side, along the wall, and I closed the distance to 8 meters and then 6, and then I stopped. My skull was already hurting. Max wasn't waiting. The pain was not modest. I have tried to describe it to people since, and I always fail. It was like having a thought too large for the space available, like something behind my eyes expanding against a surface that didn't want to expand. My vision went white at the edges. I stayed standing because staying standing was the only plan I had. At 4 meters, Witherington turned from Marcus and looked at me. Whatever Zolthard saw in my face, it was not what he expected. Because I was in pain and I was still moving and I was not afraid. Not the way he would have calculated, not in a way that produced retreat. And the model he had for human behavior under duress said that pain plus proximity plus superior numbers equaled compliance. He didn't have a good model for spite. I stopped at 2 meters. Max was projecting everything he had. The lights in the corridor flickered. My nose started bleeding. Through the white-edged blur of my vision, I watched Ms. Witherington's face go through something, a sequence of expressions that didn't belong to her, cycling through states that Zolthard was running through in rapid succession as his network went static. Around us, in the corridors, I heard footsteps changing rhythm, the too-even metronomic march of the embedded staff breaking apart, stumbling, people grabbing walls for support. Witherington said something, not in her voice, in something flatter and harder, a transmission looking for a carrier that wasn't there. Then she sat down on the floor. Her legs just stopped working in the coordinated way, and she sat down in the corridor, and her face went through one more sequence, and then she went still. The headache was enormous. I sat down next to her. "Max," I said, through a jaw that felt held together with expectation, "tell me that worked." "It worked," Max said. He sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "He's isolated. No network, no broadcast, no fleet command. We've frozen his local transmission capability. He's still in the host, but he can't do anything with that now except wait." "And Sophie?" "Right here," Sophie said. "Your nose will stop bleeding. Your headache will also stop eventually. You did well." Greta appeared beside me. She had a tissue from somewhere. Greta always had things. And she handed it to me, and I held it to my nose and leaned my head back against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. "Is she okay?" I asked. "Witherington." "She will be," Gus said, "when a Zolthard unit loses its command connection. It enters a preservation state. It won't harm the host. He still needs her as a vessel. She's suspended, but she's intact. Medical teams can extract the unit once they arrive. It is delicate work, but it can be done." "How long until you can send for those medical teams?" Once we can get a signal out. The civic hub, you said students were going there. Yes. Then someone will already be calling for help. The question is whether they'll know what kind of help. I thought about that. I thought about how you explained to a settlement emergency coordinator that a 3mm alien criminal has nested a droid unit inside a school principal's nervous system and has been building a local slave network for the past several hours, and that the solution involves peacekeepers currently residing in a 16-year-old cerebral cortex. I'm going to need help with the explanation, I said. We've done this before, Gus said, and I heard something in his voice that I hadn't heard yet, something almost warm. You might be surprised how ready people are to believe unusual things when the unusual things are already visibly true. He was right. As it turned out, he was right. The civic response came in 2 waves. The first wave was the settlement security team, who arrived with riot containment equipment they didn't need because the embedded staff were sitting on the floor in various corridors, confused and uncoordinated, and mostly just frightened now that whatever had been running them had gone quiet. The second wave was a medical team, and then a third wave, which was a notification to the colonial authority, and eventually, long after dark, after the initial chaos had been sorted into documentation and statements, and the long grinding machinery of interstellar incident management. A fourth wave arrived that had come specifically for the Meridian 6. Sophie walked me through the extraction. That's the word they used, walked, as though it was a stroll. It wasn't. It was 3 hours of very precise medical intervention in a facility that had been standing by since the second wave teams arrived and been told what they were dealing with. I was awake for most of it. The medical team wanted me conscious so I could respond to Sophie's updates in real time. They asked me things. I answered them. Sophie corrected me when I got the physiology wrong, which was often. When it was done, and the 3 of them were out and in their own environment, a temporary habitat the response team had set up in the hospital's secondary lab, sized correctly for them, Gus came to the window. I was in a bed with a headache that had declined from catastrophic to merely significant. He was on the other side of the glass, about the height of a pen, standing with the kind of posture that meant he'd been standing that way for 40 years and wasn't going to stop. He looked at me for a moment. "You did well," he said. His voice came through a small speaker the response team had set up for translation. "You said that already," I said. "Sophie said it." "It bears repeating." He looked at me steadily. "What you did moving toward her when everything in your biology was telling you to move away, that's not common. Marcus did the same thing. He distracted, you closed the distance. They're different acts." He paused. "There are species we've encountered that simply cannot do what you did today, not because they lack courage, because the mathematics of their threat response doesn't allow it. Pain plus proximity plus superior numbers produces a specific output, and that output is retreat always and without variation. You are not built that way. None of you are." Another pause. "It makes you difficult to model." "Zolthard found that out," I said. "He did," Gus said. "He will find it out again wherever they put him. He tends to." Ms. Witherington was in surgery for 6 hours. The droid unit was removed. She was herself when she woke up. I don't know everything she remembered from the time Zolthard was in residence. The medical team indicated that memory formation during embedding was inconsistent and varied by individual, but she was herself. The thing that made her eyes move the wrong way was gone, and when they let her family in, her sister grabbed her hand, and Witherington cried. And that was so unlike anything I had ever associated with her that I had to look away. The embedded staff recovered. Mr. Anderson was discharged 2 days after. I heard, secondhand, that he spent 3 hours with a school counselor before he went home, and then another 2 hours after that, and that he came back to school the following week and went directly to his classroom and taught his first class of the morning and didn't mention it. Marcus was there. He told me Mr. Anderson's hands were steady. Zolthard was extracted from the school building's infrastructure. He'd apparently nested a secondary processing node in the heating system, the way someone might leave a bag in a locker, and transferred to colonial custody. I don't know what happened after that. That part of it wasn't mine to know. The SBF was explicit about what they could and couldn't share, and I respected it, mostly because Sophie had asked me to, and I had developed a tendency to do what Sophie asked. She visited twice more before the Meridian 6 departed. Not in my head, the ship was in a proper facility by then in their habitat, and she spoke through the translation system. She asked me about school. She asked about Greta and Marcus. She asked, in a way that was technically a question but was actually a diagnosis, how I was sleeping. Fine, I said the second time, mostly fine. The headaches will continue to diminish, she said. Max sends his apologies. He pushed harder than ideal. Tell him I don't mind, I said. Tell him it worked. She nodded a small, precise movement. Then she said, you asked about Witherington, the morning after. I know she's fine. I know you know, that's not why I'm bringing it up. She paused. You asked about her before you asked about yourself, while you were still bleeding. I didn't say anything. That's a specific kind of thing, Sophie said. We've been doing this work for a long time, Gus longer than Max and me together, and you learn to recognize it. The people who, when something goes badly, look around to take stock of who else is in the room before they look at themselves. She held my gaze through the glass. That's not common either. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it. She straightened the posture of someone concluding a conversation they'd planned the shape of. Take care of yourself, Norman. You did something today that needed doing, and you did it without anyone asking you to. That matters. It doesn't stop mattering just because the incident is closed. They left the following morning. I was at school when it happened. Witherington had reopened the building, 2 days after, with a brief address to students that was the most direct I had ever heard her, and I felt the departure the same way you feel a sound stop that you'd gotten used to. A brief, sourceless absence. And then nothing. Greta noticed. She didn't say anything. She just sat with me for a while on the east steps in the warm September air, while Marcus argued with someone across the yard about something that didn't matter. The headache stopped completely after 3 weeks. The nosebleeds had stopped the same day. I'm not 16 anymore. I'm old enough now that 16 feels like a different person, not a lesser one, just earlier. Carew Station expanded. The Civic Hub became a proper emergency coordination center. Mr. Anderson retired 4 years ago, went to live near his daughter on the other side of the ridge, and still sends cards to former students at the holidays, which is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from him, and which I look forward to every year. I never heard from Gus again, or Max. Sophie sent one message, years later, a brief administrative notice, translated by an SPF communications relay, confirming that the Meridian 6 had been involved in a successful interdiction operation in the outer belt and that the crew was unharmed. That was all it said. It was enough. People ask me sometimes what the lesson is. They want a clean version of it, the thing you take away from a day when the universe breaks open and shows you what's underneath. I never have a clean version. The clean version requires you to sand off the parts that don't fit, and the parts that don't fit are usually the important ones. What I know is this. Zolthard built his network carefully. He studied populations. He found access points. He ran his models and he chose his targets and he controlled every variable he could control. He was old and experienced and patient, and he had done this many times across many worlds. He didn't model 3 teenagers with nothing but a transit token and 45 minutes, and the specific unreasonable human conviction that the people you love are worth standing in front of. He should have. Whatever is out there, whatever is watching, calculating, building its models and preparing its approaches, it should factor that in. Not the weapons, not the technology, not the response teams, not the interstellar infrastructure. The specific, irrational, unkillable stubbornness of ordinary people who have decided that enough is enough, and that somebody is going to have to come through them first. We are not an easy people to model, and we are not afraid of the dark. We've met what's in it, and we've asked it to identify itself, and we've moved toward it anyway. That's us. That has always been us. That will keep being us for a long time yet.